What happens when a president's rage disrupts global trade, leaving billions in chaos? While Trump's trade war cripples Brazil, Canada seizes its moment. Could this be the power shift no one saw coming? Let's begin. On July 30th, 2025, a remarkable opportunity crystallized for Canada as Donald Trump's latest trade war tantrum inadvertently opened doors that Canadian businesses and policymakers had been hoping to access for years. Trump's decision to impose crushing 50% tariffs on Brazil, the highest levies he had imposed on any country, represented far more than bilateral punishment. It was the systematic destruction of America's relationships with major global economies, creating unprecedented opportunities for more stable partners like Canada. The catalyst for Trump's Brazilian assault wasn't even economic, it was personal. The president's fury over his ally Jair Bolsonaro's prosecution for allegedly plotting a coup had driven him to weaponize American trade policy in ways that shocked even seasoned diplomats. By mixing personal grievances with economic warfare, Trump was demonstrating exactly the kind of unpredictability that made other countries desperate for reliable alternatives. Canada found itself perfectly positioned to capitalize on this American-created chaos. While Trump alienated Brazil, Latin America's largest economy, with over 200 million consumers, Canadian officials were quietly reaching out to Brazilian businesses facing the prospect of economic devastation from American tariffs. The message was simple. Canada offered market access without political conditions, partnership without personal vendettas. The broader implications were staggering. Brazil represented $92 billion in annual trade with the United States, making it a crucial economic relationship that Trump was sacrificing for domestic political theater. Canadian exporters, facing their own tariff threats from Trump, were discovering that America's loss could become Canada's gain in markets from coffee to beef to manufactured goods. More significantly, Trump's approach was teaching the global community a lesson that Canadian diplomats had been hoping to convey for years. In an increasingly unstable world, Canada represented reliability, professionalism, and respect for sovereignty that American partnership could no longer provide. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic economic realignments in Western Hemisphere history, with Canada emerging as the primary beneficiary of American diplomatic incompetence. The contrast between Trump's approach to Brazil and Canada's response to both countries revealed the fundamental difference between American chaos and Canadian opportunity. While Trump imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil over personal grievances about Bolsonaro's legal troubles, Canada was quietly building relationships based on mutual economic benefit rather than political interference. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's defiant response to Trump's ultimatums, calling American interference unacceptable and comparing Trump to an unwanted emperor, resonated strongly with Canadian officials who had been dealing with similar American pressure. The difference was that Canada had options that Brazil was only beginning to explore. The scope of Trump's Brazilian punishment revealed the extent of opportunity for Canadian businesses. The 50% tariffs targeted key Brazilian exports, including coffee and beef sectors, where Canadian companies could potentially fill supply gaps in global markets. While Brazilian coffee producers faced catastrophic losses, Canadian food processing companies were exploring partnerships that could help them access new distribution networks. More strategically significant was Trump's decision to sanction Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, using the global Magnitsky Act sanctions typically reserved for the world's worst human rights abusers. This extraordinary escalation demonstrated that Trump was willing to treat democratic allies like authoritarian regimes when his personal interests were threatened. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly's measured response to the Brazil crisis stood in stark contrast to Trump's vindictive approach. Rather than making demands or issuing ultimatums, Canadian officials were offering genuine partnership opportunities to both Brazilian businesses seeking alternatives to American markets and global companies looking for stable jurisdictions to base their operations. The timing couldn't have been better for Canadian interests, as Trump's 35% tariff threats against Canada looked increasingly moderate compared to Brazil's 50% reality. International businesses were recognizing that Canada faced far less American hostility than other major economies. This relative stability was making Canada increasingly attractive as a base for companies seeking to access North American markets without the political risks that characterized American partnerships. Brazilian business leaders facing the prospect of economic warfare over issues completely unrelated to trade were naturally looking for alternatives that offered economic opportunity without political interference. Canada was perfectly positioned to provide exactly what they needed. If you're enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe to our channel. On July 31st, 2025, as Trump's Brazil crisis deepened with the announcement of both tariffs and sanctions, Canadian officials launched what would later be recognized as one of the most successful economic diplomacy campaigns in the country's history. While Trump burned bridges with Latin America's largest economy, Canada was quietly building them. The immediate impact of Trump's Brazilian assault created openings that Canadian businesses had been seeking for decades. Brazilian exporters facing 50% American tariffs were suddenly desperate for alternative markets, while global companies questioned whether they could rely on American political stability for their supply chains. Canada offered solutions to both problems. Canadian Agriculture Minister Lawrence Macaulay's announcement of new trade missions to Brazil represented a masterclass in diplomatic timing. While Trump punished Brazilian farmers with tariffs, Canada was offering technological partnerships and market access that could help Brazilian agriculture modernize while accessing Canadian expertise in cold climate farming and food processing. The contrast with American approach was stark and deliberate. Where Trump demanded submission and threatened sanctions, Canada offered cooperation and mutual benefit. Where American officials mixed trade policy with personal vendettas, Canadian negotiators focused strictly on economic opportunity that benefited both countries. Brazilian coffee producers, facing devastating losses from American tariffs, found Canadian companies eager to explore partnerships that could help Brazilian beans access European and Asian markets through Canadian distribution networks. Canadian food processing companies saw opportunities to add Brazilian coffee expertise to their portfolios, while helping Brazilian producers diversify away from American dependence. The beef sector provided an even more dramatic example of Canadian opportunity. While Brazilian meat packers expected $1 billion in losses from American tariffs, Canadian meat processing companies were exploring joint ventures that could help Brazilian beef access global markets, while bringing Brazilian expertise in tropical cattle ranching to Canadian operations. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's statement that Canada remains committed to building bridges rather than walls was clearly directed at the Brazilian situation as much as Canada's own tariff challenges. The message resonated strongly with Brazilian officials who were tired of being treated like American vassals rather than sovereign partners. More strategically, Canadian officials were positioning their country as the stable alternative for global companies seeking North American market access without the political risks that characterized American partnerships. The Brazil crisis provided perfect evidence that Trump's America was simply too unpredictable for long-term business planning. The immediate consequences of Canada's strategic response to Trump's Brazil meltdown demonstrated how quickly diplomatic competence could translate into economic opportunity. Within days of Trump's tariff announcement, Canadian companies were announcing new partnerships and investments that would have been unthinkable without American-created chaos. Canadian pension funds, with their massive investment capabilities, began exploring Brazilian infrastructure projects that American political instability had made too risky for U.S. investors. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board's announcement of a new Latin American investment strategy was clearly timed to capitalize on opportunities created by American diplomatic failures. More immediately, Canadian ports from Vancouver to Halifax began preparing for increased cargo flows as Brazilian exporters sought alternatives to American markets. The Port of Montreal's announcement of expanded South American shipping partnerships represented a direct response to opportunities created by Trump's trade wars. Brazilian business delegations, traditionally focused on American partnerships, were suddenly scheduling visits to Toronto, Calgary, and Montreal as they explored alternatives to markets that Trump could close on personal whims. The message was clear. Canada offered the stability and professionalism that American partnership could no longer provide. Canadian foreign direct investment data began showing immediate increases from Brazilian companies seeking stable jurisdictions for their North American operations. Rather than facing the political risks that characterized American business environment, Brazilian companies were discovering that Canada offered market access without the threats and ultimatums that defined Trump's approach. The demonstration effect extended far beyond Brazil to other Latin American countries, watching Trump's vindictive approach with growing concern. If the United States could impose devastating tariffs on Brazil over domestic legal proceedings, what country was safe from similar treatment? Canada's measured response to global trade tensions provided an obvious alternative. Canadian trade officials reported unprecedented interest from companies across Latin America seeking partnerships that offered economic opportunity without political interference. The contrast between Canadian professionalism and American chaos was driving a fundamental reassessment of North American business relationships. The long-term implications of Canada's strategic response to Trump's Brazil crisis represent perhaps the most significant opportunity for Canadian economic expansion since the North American Free Trade Agreement. By positioning itself as the stable alternative to American unpredictability, Canada was building relationships that would persist long after Trump's trade wars ended. The Brazil relationship offered Canada access to Latin America's largest economy and a potential gateway to broader South American markets that had historically been dominated by American companies. Brazilian partnerships could provide Canadian businesses with expertise in tropical agriculture, mining, and manufacturing that would complement Canada's own industrial strengths. More strategically, Canada was demonstrating to the global community that it offered genuine partnership rather than the extractive relationships that characterized Trump's approach. While America demanded tribute payments and political submission, Canada was building mutually beneficial relationships based on shared economic interests rather than political coercion. The infrastructure implications were particularly significant for Canadian economic development. Brazilian investment in Canadian ports, transportation networks, and processing facilities could enhance Canada's ability to serve global markets while providing Brazilian companies with stable platforms for their international operations. The technology sector offered even greater long-term potential. Brazilian expertise in biofuels, tropical agriculture, and resource extraction could complement Canadian strengths in cold climate technology, artificial intelligence, and clean energy. Partnerships between Canadian and Brazilian companies could create competitive advantages that neither country could achieve independently. Perhaps most importantly, Canada's response to the Brazil crisis was establishing precedents for how middle powers could benefit from American diplomatic failures. By offering stability, professionalism, and mutual respect, Canada was positioning itself as the preferred partner for countries seeking alternatives to American dominance. The energy sector provided perfect examples of this dynamic. While Trump's political interference made American energy partnerships risky for many countries, Canada's stable regulatory environment and professional approach were attracting international investment from companies seeking reliable long-term partners. Canadian universities were reporting increased interest from Brazilian students and researchers seeking alternatives to American institutions that faced political interference in their international programs. These educational partnerships would create lasting relationships that could drive decades of future economic cooperation. The financial services sector was equally positioned to benefit from Canada's reputation for stability and professional regulation. Brazilian companies seeking alternatives to American financial markets were discovering that Canadian institutions offered comparable services without the political risks that characterized American business environment. International observers were noting how Canada's patient, professional approach was yielding better long-term results than America's aggressive tactics. While Trump's trade wars created short-term disruption and long-term resentment, Canada's partnership-based approach was building relationships that strengthened all parties involved. The demonstration effect on other global relationships was equally significant. Countries throughout Asia, Europe, and Africa were observing how Canada managed complex international relationships and drawing conclusions about the benefits of Canadian partnership compared to American demands. Perhaps most critically, Canada's success in capitalizing on American diplomatic failures was proving that middle powers could thrive by offering what major powers often couldn't: reliability, professionalism, and genuine respect for partnership. The Brazil opportunity was just the beginning of a broader realignment that would enhance Canadian influence far beyond what the country's size might suggest. The irony was unmistakable. Trump's efforts to make America great again were actually making Canada greater by demonstrating the value of competent diplomacy and professional international relationships. While America burned bridges with major economies over personal vendettas, Canada was quietly building the partnerships that would define future prosperity. Brazil's $200 million economy, with its vast natural resources and growing consumer market, represented exactly the kind of opportunity that Canadian businesses had been seeking. Trump's vindictive approach had essentially gift-wrapped this opportunity and handed it to Canada on a silver platter. The long-term implications would reshape North American economics for decades to come, with Canada emerging as the reliable partner that global businesses preferred over the chaos and unpredictability that characterized Trump's America. The Brazil crisis had given Canada something that money couldn't buy: proof that there was a better way to conduct international relations, and the world was taking notice. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like these.